architecture and history. Jason currently practices with Bercy Chen Studio in Cambrian in Austin, where, in addition to architectural design, he continues to develop participatory pre-design programming processes and architect-led development with an emphasis on mixed use, deeply affordable, and family-friendly housing.
So this may be one of the least controversial venues to make the claim that brutalism is pretty beautiful. But even if you agree with this statement, I think it's important for us to practice making that argument to wider audiences. So I'd like to practice that tonight while sharing some photography of some of the best examples I've come across in my research and travel. We need to do this now, partly because it may be obvious, but these buildings are reaching an age where they need extensive maintenance and are often threatened by demolition without the historic protections that might have previously been granted to buildings of their age, largely because the bigger problem is they're underappreciated, especially and including by their owners. Also, I think just looking around, we need to intentionally practice empathy, and to imagine others' complexity. As architects, imagine others' experiences with architecture complexly. So, before I go on, I want to clarify what I mean by brutalism. Not for the pedants, I mean not just the works rendered in béton brut, but a whole class, a whole body of late modern architecture characterized by dramatic spatial volumes and expressive, if severe, materiality. So brick's not out of the question. A lot of these could be fit under what the great Tumblr Architecture of Doom calls architecture that is often seen as bleak, gloomy, forbidding, desolate, unfortunate, and totalitarian. So I'd like to make the claim that not only that brutalism is beautiful, but I'd like to do it on hard mode. I'd like to look at Christian churches and try to form an argument based on a Christian theological aesthetics that takes beauty as transcendental, takes beauty as absolute. Because there's an easy version of this argument where we fall back on the old, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and let's all agree to disagree, and we can go home as the erudite with taste and know that we're still right. But I think that way lies smaller and smaller subcultures and a proliferation of the kind of self-sustaining echo chambers that are so eating away at what's left of our common culture, common discourse. And I can't support that. Also, I think it leads to narrower and narrower opportunities for us to experience beauty, actual beauty, especially for things that are outside our expectations and our proclaimed taste. On the other hand, the claim for the existence of an absolute truth, beauty, or goodness seems to always come attached with a claim for exclusively possessing and knowing what that truth, beauty, or goodness is. This is also severely limiting and ultimately untenable. A lot of the debates that I've heard about objectivity and subjectivity all seem to take for granted that professing and possessing absolute beauty must be the same thing. And of course, under those constraints, subjectivity is the only reasonable conclusion, since, after all, there are still disagreements. I'm not sure that objectivity and subjectivity are really a good thing to be arguing about. But to make a true argument for an absolute beauty that resolves this apparent contradiction must acknowledge that the fullness of beauty is something beyond human attainment, beyond human capacity. The great 20th century Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar made exactly that argument, and so I'd like to share a little bit of how he resolved it. He said, one may agree with this idea of a religious aesthetic, but only if it is completed by accepting all the concrete kinds of beauty immanent in the world. These are of an almost inexhaustible variety, and their combinations yield ever new variations. Their very richness is a proof of the transcendental origins of beautiful. Whether in fact this beauty is transmitted to the receiver depends on the occasion, on whether they have eyes, ears, or heart for it, whether they are open and receptive to beauty, to the beauty in question, and whether the times are propitious for the manifestation of beauty in things. Absolute beauty, so conceived, need not be, in fact, cannot be, dependent on subjective appreciation, nor can it be contained by a finite set of rules, nor limited by emotion and taste, or even defined by sensory pleasure. And thus it can contain for us what may seem a contradiction. Surely beauty may contain aspects of challenging content. Beauty may contain ugliness and suffering. And for Christian architecture, in fact, it must. This is a religion whose central narrative is one of service, of suffering, of sacrifice, and only then redemption. It is an incomplete and dishonest Christian church that promises only warmth, wealth, comfort, and happiness, just as it would be if it offered only suffering. But in austerity, there can also be transcendence and ecstasy. In simplicity of form and expressiveness of material alone can come great clarity. At least at that point, it may not need to convince architects. These architectures do not need to be acceptable to everyone to be meaningful and beautiful. But to those who are receptive and open, they can speak volumes with their high contrast of form and light. Absolute beauty does not mean that every instance of beauty must be appreciated by everyone. Also, these architectures can, perhaps paradoxically, exhibit a glorious craft, whether it's the precision formwork of St. John Abbey, or here the probably apocryphal story of Dom Hans van der Laan, the architect providing his masons with beer during lunch, so that the brick was just the right level of uneven. Or the extreme example of Peter Juncker burning out the interior of Bruder Klaus. So I offer this thought exercise as a challenge to the assumptive categorization that often is applied to these buildings, even by professionals. It might, for example, surprise us that this subtle metal screen at the rear wall of St. John Abbey was not Marcel Breuer's original intent for the church. His early drawings from the project showed his concept for figural mosaic. There is more here than reductive narratives of a modernism that is anti-historical, or even between arguments of abstraction versus figural representation. And I think the lesson is there's more here in the people who conceive these buildings and live in them than we might expect. So as we look at the more challenging architectures of the recent past, it would be helpful to not just accept our neat theoretical oppositions and reductive narratives, but instead try to imagine others complexly and imagine others' buildings more complexly. Thank you.